Hello and welcome to this edition of Swarajya Conversations. I am R Jagannathan, and with me today is a special guest, Jaithirth Jerry Rao, and he is there with me to discuss his new book. Jerry Rao has had an interesting career spanning banking, affordable housing, information technology, and investment of various kinds. Today, he is a consultant and he has written a book. And the book is called The Indian Conservative. Now, who would have suspected that there is a market for something called the conservative? So, Jerry, tell me one thing.
Yes.
What got into you that you thought you had to make a case for the Indian conservative?
I think over the last few years, about 10 or 15 years, I've gotten particularly upset and angry over the fact that academia in the West, as well as in our country, is dominated by the left. They set the agenda, they teach our students this postmodern Marxist Freudian view of our country, our society, our civilization, and there's no alternative. So I felt that if I could do a book, do a series of lectures, do a series of reach outs, giving the corrective on this, giving the conservative position, which I think is a very strong intellectual position, that was the real motivation, to provide a corrective.
Right. One thing, to be called a liberal is considered like some kind of a badge of honor. But how many people do you think will plead guilty to be called a conservative? I mean, have you worried about that sometime?
Again, this is because we've let them set the agenda, define the vocabulary. We wish to state clearly that what we mean when we are, and we concede there are overlaps between conservatives and liberals. It's not, and in any case, these words have all evolved after 1789. It's not some 2,000-year-old distinction in philosophy. This is relatively recent in human history terms. Was Adam Smith a conservative or a liberal? I mean, these are questions that can be asked, and one can, till the cows come home, one can keep talking about it. The point I wanted to make in my book was principally that conservatism is not a pure imported item. It is something that we can trace back intellectually in our country to the Shanti Parva of the Mahabharata, to Tiruvalluvar's Tirukkural, to the Apastama Sutra, the Yajurveda, to the Atharva Veda, to Allasami Peddana's 500-year-old Telugu work. So we have a body of thinking, even Kautilya, who's not completely conservative. There are conservative elements in Kautilya's thinking. We do have a conservative view of the world which is intellectually robust. And then I have said, of course, modern conservatism is largely Anglo-Saxon: Burke, Adam Smith, David Hume, Locke, Hobbes, and across the Atlantic, Jay, Hamilton, Adams, Jefferson, and of course, 19th century Disraeli and 20th century Scruton. And as I was writing this book, one of the things that I was able to kind of stumble upon is the uncanny congruence between the ideas of a Tiruvalluvar and a Roger Scruton, between the ideas of a Burke and a Shanti Parva. And so I'm saying, hey, there's something universal about this. Although, as you know, conservatives, we like local, national identities very much. But nevertheless, I think the approach, it doesn't have to be a definitive, detailed ideology. The approach is the same, and there is a universal nature to the conservative approach to problems. And I think if this respectable doctrine is attractively taught and sold to the students I think we can correct a lot of their bogus Marxist, postmodern stuff that their present professors try to inject them with.
But you define conservatism not necessarily as something that's resistant to change, but just the pace of change.
Correct.
That with the idea that the baby should not be thrown out with the bathwater.
The pace and the nature of the
And
change.
also, it should not be something that's violent and entirely disruptive.
Absolutely. Both are absolutely correct. The Apastamba Sutra talks about something called Yoga Dharma. Yoga Dharma, which means each age, each epoch has its own morality, its own dharma. And I keep telling this to people. If you were visiting Periclean Athens, where slavery was practiced, your advice to a slave owner would be, treat your slaves kindly. But today, your advice would be, don't have slavery.
Okay.
Things have changed. We no longer approve of slavery as an institution. So I also, in the same, slavery is a good example of violent change versus evolutionary change. In the state of New York, Hamilton was able to convince slave owners to give up slavery, and he paid them compensation. So they got money, slavery ended, peaceful. New York today has some of the best race relations in America. In South Carolina and Alabama, the stupid Southern plantation aristocracy refused to compromise. Lincoln repeatedly offered them compensation to give up the institution of slavery. They refused. And to this day, the racial relations there remain bitter, divisive. It takes time to heal when you take a civil war and a violent confrontation to end something. So violent changes invariably have very bad unintended consequences. And also, of course, violence is inherently immoral from a conservative perspective. Evolutionary, slow constitutional change, making sure that even as you change, you don't drop the good things of the past. There's no harm in having new architecture, but that doesn't mean you drop some great old buildings.
Some of your critics, whom you also mentioned in the book, like Ram Guha or Swaminathan Iyer, have said maybe you have just made off with some of our liberal heroes and called them conservative. Would that be a fair charge?
I think that there is merit in discussing that argument. So yes, it is fair to the extent that there is overlap, particularly in the economic area. Many liberals are supporters of markets. But I argue that the overlap is a bit illusory. Liberals support markets because they're consequentialists. Markets are more efficient, they work well, they're better than central planning, therefore. But tomorrow, if somebody could prove to them that central planning works better than markets in some particular area, they would go with that. Whereas for, I think, conservatives, it's a moral issue. Markets are voluntary, trust-based, consensual, organic institutions that have evolved, where there is no sovereign intrusion, therefore, irrespective of the consequences. Similarly, I think, not similarly, but in a historical sense, particularly in India, we have a bit of a problem because the pre-independence conservatives, many of them, I would call Gokhale a conservative, for instance, is generally referred to as a liberal or a classical liberal. One of the reasons has nothing to do with India, it has more to do with Britain. The British conservatives, the British Tories, many of them were quite silly. Instead of supporting the Indian conservatives, they ignored them. Dadabhai Nauroji could not get a conservative ticket to stand for parliament. He got a liberal ticket. So somehow Indian conservatives got associated with the word liberal. And that too has remained a confusion, particularly for the pre-independence variety.
Tell me one thing. There are, if you break down the whole concept of conservatism, there is the economic conservative.
Yeah.
There is the cultural and social conservative, right? Now, are these three parallel streams or they merge everywhere?
This is the liberal trap, actually.
Okay.
Because many of my liberal friends will come up to me and say, we are economic conservatives, but socially liberal. And I keep saying, for me, that's meaningless. Either you're conservative or you're not. because
So it's a complete package, you're saying?
I think it is more or less a complete package. I mean, there are nuances, modest differences here and there. But yes, it is a complete package because conservatives believe in institutional continuity. That's why they would like not to eliminate monarchy, but to move from absolute monarchy to constitutional monarchy. That's a good example. And this is in politics, nothing to do with economics. Similarly, conservatives are great supporters of family. They're great supporters of voluntary associations, Sangeeta Sabhas, Bhajan Mandalis, things like that, which are community initiatives which are rooted in tradition. This distinction that I'm economically conservative but socially or politically liberal, I find it clever and a little wicked.
2-3 things. One is you seem to have you are some kind of Macaulay Putra, or you believe that English is very central to our conservatism.
Yeah.
Why do you think so?
See, my point is, when you say we want to conserve the best in our past, the point I'm making is it's not just about reviving a distant past. Our recent past also we should respect. And our most recent past, at least in southern India, was 1750, Battle of Santome, till 1950, right? About 200 years of British rule and British encounter. And yes, in between, right in the bang in the middle, in the 1840s, comes Macaulay with his introduction of English. This needs to be preserved, the good parts of it, not all aspects of it, but the good parts of our encounter with the English language need to be preserved, is the point I'm making. In fact, I have tried to use a uniquely Indian argument and said Macaulay is like Rishyashringa. Rishyashringa is a rishi in Ramayana who performs this particular puja, and Prince Rama is born. Similarly, Macaulay, he was, by the way, not a very likable fellow in his own life. As a personal fellow, he was quite foolish and pompous and so on. But he gave us this gift. And this gift is something that we need to
make something of,
use, treasure, and sensibly react to. After all, Radhakrishnan Hiriyanna Dasgupta wrote some of the finest works on Indian philosophy in English. So it's not that somehow, you can't write in English good stuff, or the best stuff on Indian wildlife. Salim Ali's book on Indian birds is in English. So even encounters with our environment. So why should we jettison something that has been good, that has been constructive? That's the spirit I approach English in.
One thing, your chapter on the cultural side is, I thought, one of the best.
Thank you.
The reason being that you clearly debunk the liberal myth that India was some collection of little bits here and there, and there was no concept of the idea of India before the British came and said, look, you unified us politically, and therefore you exist.
You see, it is very much part of their insidious agenda to insist that we are simply a territorial nation state with some laws, and this accidentally happened because of the colonial encounter. Otherwise, we are 1,000 subaltern groups with no connection. And I comprehensively reject this. Benedict Anderson, the American political scientist, said that nations are imagined communities. We all imagine a nation. I'm just saying that Bharatavarsha, India, was imagined not recently, but a couple of thousand years ago. It's an old imagination. It's got both antiquity behind it, and it's got depth behind it, and it has an immense sense of the sacred behind it.
Right.
Nobody questions somebody who talks about French identity going back to the Gauls or reading Asterix comics, right? But somehow, suddenly, if we say the same about India, we are, and I reject that. Mahasti Venkatesh Iyengar, one of the greatest 20th century Kannada writers, he has used a beautiful expression in one of his works. He calls India Bahuratna Vasundhara, the earth studded with many gems. this idea, and he says, Bharatavarsha is Bharatna Vasudha. This is deeply felt.
Yes.
In 1959-60, I remember going to Rameshwaram. My mother was still alive, and suddenly from her bag she brought out this Ganga water, which she had brought from Allahabad to pour in Rameshwaram. And I did the same thing recently, about 5 years ago, because this time I had it in a plastic bottle. But essentially, I brought Ganga. These are repeat rituals connecting the country across. It is the land where Rama and Sita have traveled, which Shiva blesses, where the goddess exists in 60 places around the country, and so on and so forth. And by the way, it is not sectarian.
Yeah.
India is the only country where there is a Sufi pilgrimage circuit. A friend of mine starts in Delhi, goes to Ajmer, comes down to Ahmedabad, Bombay, Gulbarga, goes all the way south to Nagaur, comes back through Kadapa, goes to Bihar, comes back to Fatehpur Sikri. So there is a Sufi sacred circuit within the country. So the country as being sacred is a very old and repeat motive. And even
Buddhist. There's a Buddhist.
There is a Buddhist. There is a Sikh one. They go all the way to Patna Sahib, Hemkund, and Nanded Sahib in Maharashtra. So it's Jain, Shravana Belagola in South India, all the way to Jharkhand and Bihar and Mount Abu and Ranakpur in Rajasthan and Palitana in Saurashtra. So you find this repeatedly happening, and nobody questions the validity of an English identity from Shakespeare through to the Beatles and Harry Potter. But when it comes to India, somehow it's all fragmented, it's all subaltern, and this whole Foucaultian vocabulary is what they want to force on us, and I reject it. I'd rather go back to our own great historians. Radha Kumud Mukherjee talks about India being the land of pilgrims. By the way, Diana Eck
does the same thing.
She is brilliant. She's one of those foreign scholars who we owe a lot to. She understands the idea of at the foot of the country where the three oceans wash the land, the goddess is standing, defending the land. She understands the symbolism there.
Jerry, one thing I did not find myself in easy agreement with. You say that the Indian Constitution is also a conservative one, and it evolved through the stages from British era acts and other things. But tell me one thing, a constitution that's almost entirely borrowed from abroad and in which we have made 100 amendments in 70 years. I mean, the American Constitution has 1/4 the number of amendments that we had. It looks like almost anybody can change it. So how do you say this is any kind of evolutionary constitution? It seems to be more like a thing that you can change at a whim and a fancy.
Well, let's start with the process of the making of the Constitution. Okay. My argument is from Pitt's India Act and Regulating Act of the late 1700s, through the Charter Acts, through the Queen's Proclamation, through the Minto-Morley reforms, the Montagu-Kempsford reforms, and finally the Government of India Act of 1935, there is a step-by-step evolution of the constitutional process in India. And the 1950 Constitution, about 2/3 of it is a repeat of the Government of India Act of 1935. Right. So the process of constitution making in India has been evolutionary, has been step-by-step. That's point number one. Point number two, you do talk about a lot of amendments. And that is true. Indian Constitution is more easily amended than constitutions in other countries, particularly in the United States. But nevertheless, we have retained the same constitution of the First Republic of India now for 70 years. I lived in Latin America many years ago, and there I was witness to constitutions being completely dropped every 10 years and new constitutions being written. That, to my mind, is what is revolutionary, radical. Ours, yes, it would be nicer if we had fewer amendments, particularly if in fact, now we do need an amendment to reintroduce property as a fundamental right and to get rid of the socialist business from the preamble. But yes, I would prefer fewer amendments, but it is still, in the scheme of things, far more conservative in process and in action than the constitutions of, look at France, Fourth Republic, Fifth Republic, Sixth Republic, have lots of republics. They changed the whole thing. Ceylon, Sri Lanka, they have a regular constitution, Westminster style. Then somebody says no presidential. Then somebody says no prime ministerial. Quasi. They're doing it all the time and they're hurting themselves. Whereas we are not doing such a bad job with it. So to that extent, I would say, now there are aspects of the Indian constitution which are quite radical. It abolishes untouchability at one stroke. That's a fairly...
And universal franchise.
Universal franchise, I would argue, was not such a radical move. It was a step-by-step move.
But even the Constituent Assembly wasn't done by universal franchise.
But it was not done based on caste or religion.
Right.
The 1937
But
elections...
you did have communal elections.
1937 elections was property, income and education. And they had separate electorates for Hindus, Muslims and Sikhs. Separate electorates were abolished in 1950. And in 1952 election, property, income, education was removed. Only age was retained. Everyone over 21 was allowed to vote. So even there, by the way, women were allowed to vote even as early as 1907. Okay. So the idea that women with property, with education could vote. And Dalits, scheduled castes with property and education could vote. So it was never denied to them. Like in America, the racial exclusion was there of franchise. It was never there under the British. So yes, it was fairly what shall I say, bold move. But again, there's a process of continuity there. But abolition of untouchability was a particularly very bold move. And I think we owe that a great deal to Gandhi's kind of promise when he went on a fast unto death to prevent separate electorates for the Dalits. He kind of made an implicit promise on the part of larger society that this practice would end. And step by step, it started ending, but it was formally and legally abolished in 1950.
Right. So, in the present pantheon and things that are happening, who do you see as a conservative politician?
In India?
In India.
It's pretty difficult to find anyone, right? So the way I argue is that those of us who have conservative inclinations, we have to look for and support those elements, those individuals within the BJP, within the Congress, who are of the conservative persuasion, or who are more likely to be, in the case of the BJP, who are more likely to be market friendly, for instance, than being statist, because there are statist and Luddite elements in the BJP. So we need to kind of find those who are likely to be market friendly and push them in that direction. Within the Congress, despite all their overwhelming leftist dominance, intellectual dominance by the leftists, there are people like Amrinder Singh, Manmohan Singh, who are still repositories of a conservative tradition within the Congress, and we need to engage with them and encourage them and support them. But to find a clear-cut conservative of the Rajagopalachari type or the Masani type is going to be pretty tough today.
What you're saying is that we should infiltrate all the parties like the way the left infiltrated the Congress?
Correct. Huh? This was the idea put forward by Rajni Kothari, the great political scientist in the 50s and 60s. He said when there's single party dominance, the way you do it is you set up your fifth columnists inside that party and you try to influence the party there.
Okay. So one last question. How do conservatives view the state? I mean, for example, in no country today is the role of the state any lesser than what it was, say, 200 years ago. I mean, they all account for 30, 40, 50% of GDP. Huh?
We view it with deep suspicion. See, the idea that a king should have untrammeled power or should intrude into our daily lives is something that would have horrified Thiruvalluvar. I mean, the sovereign's role was limited. For him, the hero was the plowman. It is the plowman who who alone, the sovereign is incidentally is around there to do his Raja Dharma, not to
Interfere in the life
tell
of-
us what to do. Yes, so it is quite horrifying. I think it's technologically driven. I think when you have an agricultural and a mercantile kind of civilization, it is possible to have a relatively benign state and sovereign. But as technology, like all this social media, and the state does get a lot of power, and we have to keep fighting this continuous battle. Sabotage, if you will. Even if we know that we might lose, we can't
need to do
not
Right.
fight it, to keep fighting the rearguard action. Because the idea that all kings will behave well, we know is not true.
not
Sooner or later, they will become tyrants if we let them.
Right. Thank you, Jerry. This is a fantastic book.
Thank
to
you.
all our readers, I recommend this. You will have an intellectual feast and a lot to fight about also. And if you want to fight, you know where Jerry is. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jaggi. So kind of you. Thank you.